Number 9. Hellish hazing. While pledging into the Theta Chi Fraternity at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey in early 2022, 19-year-old Armand Runt fell down a flight of stairs. He was hospitalized with severe injuries, including multiple skull fractures, but miraculously, he survived the incident. In a lawsuit filed several months later, Runt claimed he was forced to drink life-threatening amounts of alcohol before he fell down the stairs. He accused fraternity members of trying to conceal evidence in the case and waiting 3 hours to call for medical help. Runt is seeking damages from Rutgers and the fraternity's local and grand chapters. Theta Chi and Rutgers declined to comment, citing policies against discussing ongoing litigation. However, they said they have a strict policy against hazing, and while Rutgers prohibits alcohol from being present at Greek events, some of the university students told News 12 New Jersey that hazing remains a problem on campus. Senior student Etienne Dido said that Rutgers does a lot in an attempt to prevent hazing, but at the end of the day, rules are still going to be broken behind closed doors. Several news outlets pointed out that Runt's case bears similarities to the 2017 hazing of Timothy Piazza, who repeatedly fell over after drinking a dangerous amount of alcohol during a pledging ceremony at Penn State University. The young man tumbled down a flight of stairs and landed face down at the bottom. He suffered severe head trauma, a shattered spleen, and a traumatic brain injury. Piazza's fellow pledges waited 12 hours to call an ambulance, despite being well aware that he was unresponsive. They also made several failed attempts to wake him. One member later claimed he confronted several of his frat brothers and insisted Piazza needed medical care, but was dismissed and told to leave the party. By the time he was taken to the hospital, he was gravely injured and covered in blood. He died several hours later, and some of the fraternity's members served jail time for their role in the tragedy. In 2021, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy signed the Timothy J. Piazza Law, imposing a statewide ban on hazing. Number 8. A crashed party. Literally. Carly Carroll was a sophomore at the University of North Texas in 2017 when she found herself feeling increasingly frustrated with the constant parties being thrown by the students who lived above her. She wasn't only bothered by the noise from the disruptive gatherings, she was scared because she noticed that her ceiling would bounce up and down as if it were on the verge of collapse. The young woman called the police in Denton, Texas, several times to complain, but it never stopped the next party from happening. After a major football victory against the University of Texas, Carly's upstairs neighbors threw one of their biggest bashes yet, with as many as 100 people cramming into the third-floor apartment. Things got even crazier when local DJ Deo Oyanuga arrived and began blaring music. He later told CBS 11 that he felt the floor sink while he carried his equipment inside, but he continued on with his plans. The apartment was soon packed to the brim and overflowing onto the balcony. Speaking with local station WFAA, the party's host, Abiola Basari, said that he could feel the floor shaking under the weight of the massive crowd. He realized things had gotten way out of hand, but was unable to get anyone to leave. Between the noise and the sight of the obviously unstable ceiling, Carly and her roommates no longer felt safe. They left and headed toward the police station to complain. In the meantime, the floor opened up and swallowed at least a half-dozen partygoers. They all plunged into Carly's apartment below, along with furniture, liquor bottles, and structural supports. Chaos ensued as people attempted to flee the growing hole, leaving some individuals perilously trapped on narrow remaining stretches of floor as they clung to the wall. Emergency responders rescued partygoers from between floors, while police down at the station told Carly that her apartment was completely destroyed. She lost nearly all her belongings and was among 50 of the building's residents who were suddenly homeless. While it's impossible not to expect college kids to be rowdy from time to time, it sounds like Carly's neighbor was overdoing it with the partying and like it was severely interfering with her ability to live normally. Hopefully, she found a new place to live in a stabler building with quieter neighbors. Number 7. Polly Rogers. After finishing her last day of classes at the end of the 2018 spring semester, 20-year-old University of North Carolina sophomore Polly Rogers went out to celebrate in downtown Charlotte. She thought she'd have a fun time and then return home, but things took an unexpected, horrifying turn when she boarded a party bus that had been rented by the school's Kappa Sigma fraternity. As the bus drove toward an uptown bar, Rogers leaned against an emergency window and fell out, landing in the road's center lane. Witnesses rushed over to try and stop oncoming traffic, but motorists either didn't notice or ignored them and drove over the injured young woman. In the meantime, the rest of the 55 bus passengers huddled together outside as they struggled to take in the reality of what had just happened. Emergency responders pronounced Polly dead at the scene. Authorities were quick to conclude that speed most likely wasn't a factor in the tragedy, and there was no signs that she was being reckless or doing anything wrong. Victor Rabb, who owns the company that the fraternity rented the bus from, said it was the first time anything like this had ever happened in its 13 years of operation. He told local station WBTV that at some point someone must have pulled the emergency window, leaving it unsecured. Rabb said that he didn't know if anything could have been done differently to prevent Polly's death, since it was his first time dealing with this type of incident. In memory of the tragically killed student, who was studying special education, staff at UNC's Botanical Gardens created a therapeutic environment for kids with autism and other disabilities called the Polly Rogers Memorial Sensory Garden. Number 6. Rachel Lennart. In 2015, 35-year-old mother of 5, Rachel Lennart, hosted a party at her home in Evans, Georgia for her daughter and the young woman's friends. She was later accused of allowing the teens to drink and smoke marijuana. She even allegedly participated in a game of Naked Twister before retreating to a bathroom with an 18-year-old man for intimacy. Things got even more bizarre after the bathroom encounter when Lennart supposedly put on an obscene performance in the living room while partygoers watched. After the bash, the former Mormon Sunday school teacher realized her behavior was out of control and vowed to quit drinking, which she'd started doing recently after separating from her husband. She sought help from Alcoholics Anonymous and spilled the details of the wild party to her sponsor. Her sponsor then reported Lennart's disturbing claims to the Columbia County Sheriff's Office, and an investigation was launched. She was charged with 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor and ended up losing custody of all 5 of her children. She was sentenced to 6 years of probation, and she reassured the public that she was dedicated to remaining sober and getting professional help to prevent her from behaving in such an unacceptable way ever again. An undisclosed source told the New York Daily News that as someone who grew up in the Mormon church, Lennart never drank alcohol until well into her adulthood. She began hitting the bottle after her husband of 15 years returned from a military deployment to Iraq with anger issues and post-traumatic stress disorder. According to the source, as an inexperienced drinker, Lennart didn't know how to handle her alcohol. This meant that she did herself a huge favor by quitting, especially after a handful of bad decisions nearly ruined her life. Number 5. Millie Robinson and Bailey Meadows. During the early days of the coronavirus lockdown in April 2020, police responded to a noise complaint at a residence in the English town of Eastbourne. It was clear to the officers that an illegal party was going on in violation of COVID-related restrictions. They were met by 2 combative young women who denied them entry into the home. The girls also punched and kicked the officers, and they threw a toilet roll holder at them. One of the suspects, 21-year-old Millie Robinson, was noticeably intoxicated and warned a female officer to watch out, claiming she was infected with the coronavirus. When a male officer tried to arrest Robinson, she became violent. She and her friend, 21-year-old Bailey Meadows, were arrested for their behavior. In court, Robinson's lawyer said his client was struggling to adjust to lockdown, which had caused her mental health to decline. The attorney defending Meadows also cited mental health struggles, but said that his client didn't remember much of the incident. Robinson pleaded guilty to 2 counts of assaulting an emergency worker and was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Meadows pleaded guilty to assault with actual bodily harm and received a 1-year sentence. Number 4. Terror at Texas A&M. 2 people were killed and at least a dozen others were injured in 2019 when a gunman opened fire on a crowd at a party in Greenville, Texas. 4 of the survivors were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Most of the attendees at the off-campus homecoming bash were Texas A&M University students. As many as 750 people packed into the bar-like party venue. When the shots rang out, hundreds of partygoers frantically tried to flee the building, with some even shattering the windows in their attempts to escape. Law enforcement was already on the scene in response to complaints about vehicles parked illegally along the side of the road. They were questioning a seemingly drunk partygoer when the chaos broke out, but were unable to immediately pursue the shooter due to the panicking crowd. This gave the suspect an opportunity to quietly slip away into the night. During a news conference, Hunt County Sheriff Randy Meeks said that the attendees were being uncooperative with investigators and that nobody seemed willing to provide a description of the shooter. It was hard to believe that not a single person caught a good enough look at the perpetrator to describe them to the police. Authorities arrested a 23-year-old suspect, but the charges were dropped just weeks later. If anyone knows anything about the shooter, they're keeping tight-lipped about it, and the case remains unsolved to this day. Number 3. Maskless mayhem. In early 2021, somewhere between 500 and 800 students from the University of Colorado's Boulder campus flooded the streets of a nearby neighborhood. They partied outside for hours without their COVID masks, setting off fireworks, blaring music, and even flipping over a car. Police arrived in a SWAT vehicle and warned the partygoers to leave the area over a loudspeaker, threatening to deploy tear gas if they failed to comply. That was all some students needed to hear to convince them to leave, but others were less cooperative. The stubborn stragglers began yelling expletives. They charged at the cops. Some of them even threw rocks and bottles at the officers. The chaos eventually dissipated, leaving some officers with minor injuries and damage to property and cars, including street signs and emergency responders' vehicles. In a news conference following the mayhem, Boulder County District Attorney Michael Doherty made it clear that what happened wasn't a party, but a riot. He and other officials vowed to track down those responsible for the reckless behavior so they could be held accountable for their actions. By the time the investigation concluded months later, 10 arrests had been made in connection with the destruction, and 3 suspects had warrants out for their arrest. Number 2. Carly Wood. During the early morning hours one day in November 2022, police were dispatched to a home in Omaha, Nebraska in response to a reported shooting. They arrived to find 20-year-old Carly Wood dead from a gunshot wound. 7 others at the scene had also been shot, but they were still alive. The survivors were rushed to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. Investigators concluded that the shooting wasn't random, but they don't believe Carly was the intended target. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and she paid for it with her life, bringing her dreams of home ownership to an untimely end. Authorities urged the public to come forward with tips that could help solve the crime and offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to the shooter's identification and arrest. Several weeks later, they charged 25-year-old Imhotep Davis with 7 felonies, including second-degree murder, assault, using a weapon to commit a felony, tampering with evidence, and more. Davis remains behind bars while awaiting his next scheduled court date in early 2023. Few details about the circumstances of the shooting have been released, and the case is ongoing. Number 1. Rodney Tyreek Cohen II. During a house party to welcome back a returning soldier in Cobb County, Georgia in 2017, an altercation broke out among partygoers. Multiple people began firing into the crowd, and a 20-year-old man from Dallas, Texas, named Rodney Tyreek Cohen II was shot several times and died from his injuries. Officers who responded to the scene determined that Cohen was involved in the disagreement, but they declined to reveal whether he had a gun. In early 2018, suspects James Hunter Raynal, Austin James Postel, and Adam Maurice Summers were indicted on counts of malice murder and felony murder. The story went quiet in the news, and the outcome of the case is unclear. Records show that Raynal was released from prison in June of 2022 after serving a year behind bars for what appear to be unrelated charges.
8. Ashley Bautista. A rising rapper from Manhattan used her social media fame to trick her own fan base into a credit card scheme in July 2018. Ashley Bautista, who often goes by her stage name Young Ash, was marched into Manhattan Supreme Court in handcuffs, where she pleaded not guilty to grand larceny. The flamboyant artist was known to be a recruiter, and she flashed wads of cash on social media, promising that her followers could earn fast money if only they gave up their bank account information. Along with 5 co-defendants, Young Ash was indicted for allegedly using several victims' personal information. According to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, she also supposedly forged ATM cards and checks so that she could withdraw money from bank accounts, a scheme known as card cracking. Young Ash's co-defendant, 32-year-old Gabriel Molina, worked as a concierge at a luxury building on the Upper West Side. He was responsible for collecting the residents' rent checks, but he secretly took pictures of the checks and sent them to 23-year-old Fray Luis Henriquez, who used the images to create forged checks. Henriquez and Molina used the bank accounts of Young Ash's fans to deposit the fraudulent checks and withdraw money. 21-year-old Jared Bailey and 22-year-old Justin Simon apparently acted as runners who would deposit checks and withdraw money from the accounts. Unfortunately, the outcome of this case is unclear, and there hasn't been any new updates since March 2019. 7. Renee Bark. Renee Bark was only 18 years old when she moved to Uganda from Bedford, Virginia in September of 2007. She spent the first 10 months there serving on a mission trip that primarily worked with babies. Bark returned to the US the next year, but felt like it was her calling to go back to Uganda. So in 2009, she moved there permanently to start her own company called Serving His Children. On the organization's website, it explains that it's a non-profit that was initially started by Bark to provide free meals to families who are in dire need of nourishment. But later, the organization changed its focus to children in particular, and they offered treatment for those who were suffering free of charge. According to ABC News, Serving His Children worked with local nurses and doctors. However, a lawsuit was filed in 2018 that revealed that Bark had also claimed to be a doctor, even though she had no medical training. This was a lie that contributed to the deaths of hundreds of children. The advocacy group called Women's Pro Bono Initiative filed the lawsuit against Bark as well as her organization on behalf of 2 mothers from Uganda who claimed that their children passed away as a result of Bark's treatments. Per ABC News, Bark misrepresented herself and said she was a medical official, something the mothers only discovered wasn't the case after both of their children had died. Former field program manager for Serving His Children, Charles Olweny, said in an affidavit that he personally saw Bark offer diagnoses, take blood, write prescriptions, and administer drugs through IVs she put on herself. Olweny also accuses the organization of having high death rates. Every week, he said he would drive 7 to 10 bodies of children back to their families. Bark has adamantly denied all the accusations against her. She told ABC News that her organization did the very best with what they were handed, and that sometimes they were given really rough situations. According to the last update on the case from the Women's Pro Bono Initiative and Ugandan High Court records from December 2022, Bark is currently in the US, but she's since stepped down from her position in the organization. She failed to appear at her set court date, but her lawyers were able to delay her suit. 6. Sam Bankman-Fried. In May of 2019, FTX was launched by Sam Bankman-Fried as a trading platform for investors of cryptocurrency. But in late 2022, the US Securities and Exchange Commission accused Sam of defrauding his company's investors by moving money from FTX into Alameda Research LLC, a hedge fund had opened years earlier with his pal, Gary Wang. From between 2019 and 2022, Sam and other company executives used stolen cash to purchase expensive homes in the Bahamas, invest in companies to make more money, and fund favored political causes. However, when crypto assets took a plunge in 2022, FTX and Alameda Research ran out of cash, and FTX owed its customers around $8 billion. According to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, this is when federal prosecutors stepped in and issued fraud charges. By November of that same year, both companies that were started by Sam went bankrupt. Sam was arrested in the Bahamas on December 12, 2022, and a week later, a judge approved his transfer to the US to face charges of money laundering and fraud. After being extradited to Palo Alto, California, Sam was released on a $250 million bond, but was ordered to stay in the area. He's currently being electronically monitored to ensure that he stays put. The case is ongoing. 5. Elizabeth Holmes. Elizabeth Holmes found herself in hot water in 2015 when her company's automated compact blood testing device was found by medical professionals to be unworkable. Holmes started Theranos, an innovative healthcare tech company, in 2003 when she was just 19 years old. She planned to make the common blood test quicker and more efficient and accurate, but she never accomplished her initial goal. In the beginning, Theranos was flush with hundreds of millions of dollars in equity investments, and the company was valued at $10 billion by the end of 2014. But after getting called out by medical professionals in 2015, fraud charges were filed against Theranos by federal and state regulators. The company was absolutely crushed under the weight of legal fees, and just 3 years later in 2018, Theranos completely dissolved. Holmes fought in court battles between November and December of 2022, but in the end, she and the company's former president, Ramesh Balwani, were found guilty of fraud. The woman that was once hailed as the next Steve Jobs has now been sentenced to serve more than 11 years in prison for defrauding her company's investors. However, Holmes will likely appeal against the sentence to try and get less jail time. 4. Takashi Miyagawa. A fraudster from Japan was busted in 2021 for allegedly scamming more than 35 women with whom he pretended to be in a serious relationship with. 39-year-old Takashi Miyagawa worked part-time and didn't even have his own address when he began scamming women out of their hard-earned cash. He told each of his girlfriends that his birthday was on different dates so he could receive plenty of gifts. Shockingly, all of these girls were oblivious to each other's existence, apparently blinded by love. In Takashi's most recent scam, he told his 47-year-old lover that his birthday fell on February 22nd, even though it's actually on November 13th. He apparently told another victim that his birthday was in July, while a third girl thought it was in April. In total, he gained around $930 worth of clothes, cash, and presents. Takashi reportedly met all these women while he was selling them shower heads, as well as other products from an unnamed company. He also began relationships with each girl under the assumption that eventually they would get married. Takashi conned at least 35 women before they all found out and reported him to the police in February 2021. Japan-based news station MBS News confronted Takashi in public before criminal charges were filed and posted their footage to YouTube. The video shows Takashi running away from a reporter, simply refusing to answer his questions. An investigation into the charges of fraud began, but the outcome of the case is unclear. 3. Adam Wheeler. Adam Wheeler duped the Harvard admissions office, and he defrauded the university out of more than $40,000 in prizes and grants, and he wasn't caught until September 2010. The Delaware native was in his early 20s when he pulled off one of the craziest scams of all time. Wheeler lied to get himself into the prestigious college. He forged documents that said he'd received perfect SAT scores and other paperwork that claimed he'd attended Phillips Academy in Andover and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But in reality, Wheeler had been kicked out of Maine's Bowdoin College, and his SAT scores were far from perfect. His scam was discovered when he applied for the Rhodes and Fulbright scholarships when he was a senior at the university. Along with the application for the scholarship, he included a transcript that showed his perfect grades and a list of articles and books he claimed to have written. However, when one of his professors noticed that Wheeler's work had been plagiarized, he took a closer look into the student's background and found out that his entire record was fabricated. Middlesex County District Attorney Jerry Leone called Wheeler's elaborate deception an entangled web of lies and deceit in a brazen and offensive scheme. Apparently, the fraudster didn't give up his ruse, even after Harvard accused him of plagiarism. Instead, he applied for an internship at McLean Hospital, a rather prestigious medical facility. But the hospital turned Wheeler down after completing an extensive background check, which proved that he'd greatly misrepresented himself. In the end, Wheeler was indicted on 20 counts of identity fraud, larceny, pretending to hold a degree, and falsifying an endorsement or approval. He pleaded guilty to all the charges brought against him and was consequently sentenced to 10 years of probation by Associate Justice Diane M. Kottmeyer. Wheeler was also ordered to pay $45,806 in restitution to Harvard University and had to undergo psychological treatment. 2. Travis Deloy Peterson. A Georgia federal court sentenced a man from Utah to federal prison in March 2022 for operating a fake veterans charity and for running an illegal robocall scam. 54-year-old Travis Deloy Peterson was sentenced to 3 years and 5 months behind bars, followed by 5 years of supervised release on March 23, 2022. Peterson will also have to pay over $540,000 in restitution to all the victims that were affected by his scheme. In November of that same year, after Peterson was accused of running a scam that used millions of robocalls to convince people to donate their vehicles and other items that would go to support veterans charities, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of mail fraud. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Georgia, Peterson's scam, which regularly targeted senior citizens, earned the fraudster over $500,000. U.S. Attorney Kurt Erskine had this to say in a press release. Peterson shamefully defrauded thousands of people while supposedly helping veterans. He went on to explain that fraudsters typically rely on the goodwill of unsuspecting citizens because it often perpetrates their schemes. Peterson ran the scheme between April 2012 and July 2018, registering companies that he was representing as tax-exempt charities in Utah, Michigan, and Nevada. But in reality, none of the companies were really tax-exempt charities. Before Peterson got his charges in Georgia, a complaint was filed against him by the Federal Trade Commission in Utah's federal court. This led to an order being passed which permanently barred Peterson from soliciting charitable donations and from making robocalls. That same order also forced him to give up 88 of his vehicles. According to court records, Peterson was out on bond at the time of his sentencing hearing, and he was allowed to voluntarily surrender to the authorities. He'll now serve his time behind bars with the U.S. Bureau of Prisons. 1. COVID crooks. Since the global pandemic started back in 2020, almost $100 billion of COVID relief funds have been defrauded throughout the US. At the end of 2021, the Secret Service announced that almost 1,000 investigations into these startling financial frauds were underway. Surprisingly, 2 well-known athletes have already been handcuffed for their part in defrauding the government. Former New York Jets wide receiver Kenbrell Tompkins and U.S. Olympic speed skater Allison Marie Baver. Tompkins' damages were somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, while Baver apparently gained $10 million in fraudulent funds. According to the District of Utah's U.S. Attorney's Office, 41-year-old Baver was charged with money laundering as well as 8 counts of making a false statement to a bank after she defrauded around $10 million of COVID relief funds. In April 2020, Baver applied for 8 Paycheck Protection Program loans, and she sought millions of dollars for her production company that she founded in 2019 called Allison Baver Entertainment. Per court documents, Baver tricked the government into thinking that her company had a monthly payroll of $4.7 million, when in reality she had none at all. She apparently claimed to have employed anywhere from 100 to 430 people, which the government now believes are all phony. Prosecutors on the case are hoping to make Baver pay back around $9.7 million of her funds. If convicted on all counts, she could also face upwards of 40 years behind bars. On January 18, 2022, Baver was due for arraignment. Kenbrell Tompkins pled guilty to unauthorized access device fraud and 1 count of aggravated identity fraud in October of 2020. Allegedly, Tompkins stole the identities of multiple Florida residents in order to apply for COVID unemployment benefits while he was in California. He was awarded $300,000 in debit cards under false pretenses as a result. Tompkins apparently withdrew around $230,000 of those funds at ATMs around Miami-Dade County. He's scheduled to be sentenced on January 6, 2022, and if convicted, he could face up to 12 years behind bars.
Number 8. Richard Beasley. 48-year-old Scott Davis was thrilled to score a job as a live-in caretaker at a rural farm in Ohio in 2011. He made plans to move to the area from South Carolina to be near his ailing mother. He scored the gig through a Craigslist ad, which listed to pay at $300 per week and claimed to include free housing on the property. The ad specifically sought an older person who was preferably single. Davis packed up his belongings and drove to the remote site to meet his new boss, who called himself Jack and who had a younger man with him. Out of nowhere, one of the men shot Davis through the elbow. Davis ran for his life and hid in the wilderness for the next 7 hours before approaching a house and asking the owner to dial 911. As news of the crime spread, a woman contacted the police and said that her brother, David Pauly, had responded to a similar Craigslist ad months earlier. He went missing after driving to Ohio to start the job. Pauly's murdered remains were found in the same woods, where an attempt was made on Davis's life, along with the body of a third victim who was identified as Richard Geiger. There was also a fourth victim, Timothy Kern, whose body was found behind a mall. Police determined that the Craigslist ads were crafted with the specific intention of luring single middle-aged men who were down on their luck to their deaths. The only possible motive investigators could come up with was a desire to kill for fun. Detectives traced the Craigslist ads and zeroed in on 52-year-old Richard Beasley as their prime suspect. He was convicted of a slew of charges and was sentenced to death in 2013. Beasley's young accomplice, Brogan Rafferty, was convicted of 3 counts of aggravated murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Number 7. DeAndrea Holloway. 22-year-old Lise Dodd was 8 months pregnant with her first child when her decapitated body was found inside her Alton, Illinois apartment in 2022. The young woman's mother made the gruesome discovery. Police found Lisa's severed head in a garbage dumpster outside. Lisa's family was planning to throw her a surprise baby shower when they suddenly found themselves preparing for her funeral. They had bought gifts for the baby and sent out invitations, and they were looking forward to the start of a new chapter in Lisa's life. Suspicion quickly fell on her ex-boyfriend, DeAndrea Holloway, who wasn't the baby's father. The pair had dated off and on for 2 years, and the relationship was contentious, leading Lisa's mother, Heidi Noel, to frequently check on her daughter. Heidi hadn't heard from Lise in a while, so she went to check on her. Holloway was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, intentional homicide to an unborn child, dismembering a human body, concealment of a homicide, and a motor vehicle-related charge. A court-appointed psychiatrist found him unfit to stand trial, but predicted that the suspect will become fit within a year of receiving proper mental health treatment. For now, the disturbing case remains at a standstill. Number 6. Andrew Urdiales. Andrew Urdiales was a U.S. Marine stationed at Camp Pendleton in California when he committed his first murder in 1986. He stalked 23-year-old college student Robin Brandley and stabbed her 41 times in Mission Viejo. 2 years later, in 1988, Urdiales fatally shot 29-year-old Julie McGee and dumped her body in a ditch. His next murder came 2 months later in San Diego, where he killed 31-year-old Mary Ann Wells and discarded her remains in an abandoned warehouse. The serial slayer's 5th murder happened in 1989, when he left 18-year-old Tammy Irwin's body in the streets of Palm Springs. Urdiales managed to fly under the radar long enough to be honorably discharged from the military in 1991. The following year, he kidnapped a nurse named Jennifer Asbenson, who became his first and only victim to escape. Asbenson opened the trunk of her kidnapper's car from the inside and ran for her life in the remote desert while he chased her with a machete. A truck driver picked her up and took her to the police, but none of the information she gave them led them any closer to the killer at the time. In fact, detectives had yet to connect the murders and realized they had a serial killer on their hands. Urdiales laid low for the next 3 years and continued to evade suspicion for his crimes. He resumed his years-long murder spree in 1995 when he killed 32-year-old Denise Maney in the California desert. His last 3 homicides happened in Illinois and Indiana in 1996. Police became suspicious of Urdiales the following year and seized his gun to determine if it matched evidence from some of the crime scenes. During questioning, he confessed to every single murder. He never offered a rational motive beyond the fact that he seemed to hate women. Urdiales was first tried in Illinois, where he received a death sentence. When the state governor commuted his sentence to life in prison, prosecutors in California sought to have him extradited so they could try him for his crimes there and seek the death penalty. He was convicted of 5 murders in California and was sentenced to death in 2018. Urdiales took his own life in his prison cell less than a month later. Number 5. Robert Joe Long. Starting in 1981, Bobby Joe Long lured dozens of women into private settings and brutally attacked them. He allegedly targeted around 50 victims through classified ads before he was convicted of just one of the attacks in 1981. Long was granted a new trial, and the case was thrown out. Over an 8-month period in 1984, he abducted, assaulted, and murdered at least 10 women in the Tampa Bay area. At the time, Long was on probation for a previous assault case, but he managed to go undetected as he carried out his campaign of terror. He targeted vulnerable women who were alone, including prostitutes, and killed them by either strangling them, cutting their throat, or bludgeoning them to death. Toward the end of Long's killing spree, he abducted a young woman named Lisa McVeigh with the intention to kill her. McVeigh pretended to care about her captor and played on his sympathies by telling him that she was the only child of a severely ill mother. In the meantime, Lisa left as many fingerprints as she possibly could throughout his home so there would be evidence at the scene. She persuaded Long to release her and provided police with critical information that led to his identification and capture. He eventually confessed to all the murders and received 28 life sentences, 4 99-year sentences, and 1 death sentence. Long sat on death row for more than 30 years before Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant in 2019. He offered no final words in the moments before his execution at the age of 65. Number 4. Stephen Supple. Stephen Supple and his wife Cheryl were devout Catholics and highly esteemed members of their community in Iowa City, Iowa. After marrying in 1990, they adopted 4 children from Korea. The family attended church weekly and, by all appearances, lived a wholesome and morally upstanding lifestyle. Cheryl had no idea that her husband committed serious financial crimes until he was indicted in 2008 for embezzlement and money laundering. The bank Stephen worked for was accusing him of stealing over $559,000 over a 7-year period. He lost his job, and Cheryl returned to work to support the family. Stephen was awaiting trial when he dialed 911 one morning and said that the police needed to go to his home immediately. He wasn't there when officers arrived, but they found the rest of the family dead from blunt force trauma. There was a handwritten confession left behind by Stephen, along with several answering machine messages detailing his activities after he committed the murders. He offered no specific motive for the killings, but all signs point toward his impending prison time and his failure to financially support his family as major contributing factors. 5 minutes after dialing 911 and summoning police to his home, Stephen took his own life by crashing his minivan into a telephone pole. Number 3. Sean Great. Police in Ashland, Ohio received a terrifying call in 2016 from a woman who said she was just feet away from her sleeping kidnapper. She had been held captive in an abandoned house for 3 days, didn't know the address, had been brutalized repeatedly, and was afraid to try escaping. Thankfully, police figured out where the house was and rescued her. The woman's abductor, Sean Great, was a serial grifter with a history of erratic behavior and a lengthy past of abusing and living off women. Great met his kidnapping victim at a local community center and gained her trust over a long period before inviting her over and refusing to let her leave. He initially tried convincing the police that the victim was with him willingly, but he began admitting to bits and pieces of the truth when it became clear that there was no way the police were going to believe him. While searching the abandoned home, police found the decomposing bodies of two missing women, Stacey Stanley and Elizabeth Griffith. Under intense questioning, Great admitted to killing the women and confessed to 3 other murders that took place between 2006 and 2016. He targeted vulnerable victims with deceptive charm and didn't need much of a reason to kill them. In one case, he murdered a woman because he thought she had stolen $4 from him at a bar. Great was convicted of all 5 of the murders he confessed to. He received several life sentences and was sentenced to death and is scheduled to be executed in 2025. But Ohio banned lethal injection in 2020 and doesn't allow any other methods of capital punishment, leaving Great's future uncertain. Number 2. Tim Boczkowski. On November 4, 1990, 911 dispatchers in Greensboro, North Carolina received a call from 34-year-old Tim Boczkowski, who reported finding his wife, Elaine, unresponsive in their bathtub. By the time first responders arrived, it was too late to save her life. Tim told investigators that Elaine was a heavy drinker and made her death sound like an accident, but there were several obvious red flags at the scene. There was no noticeable smell of alcohol, and the tub was completely dry. While awaiting autopsy reports, detectives discovered that Tim's business and marriage were both failing, and he was in dire financial straits. The autopsy confirmed that there was no alcohol in Elaine's system, and her lungs showed no clear evidence of being underwater like Tim had claimed. Her cause of death was ruled undetermined, and the investigation stopped there. Tim collected a $25,000 life insurance payout, packed up his 3 kids and moved to Pittsburgh, where he remarried in 1994. Later that year, he dialed 911 and reported finding his wife, Mary Ann, unresponsive in their hot tub. By the time police arrived, Mary Ann was dead. The alleged tragedy was eerily similar to Elaine's death. Tim described Mary Ann as a heavy drinker, but there were no signs of alcohol consumption at the scene. He also had suspicious scratches on his neck, which looked like defensive wounds, and failed a polygraph. Authorities had to wait for autopsy results before they could charge Tim with murder. During that time, he collected on a $100,000 life insurance policy he had taken out on Mary Ann and paid for with money they received as wedding gifts. Mary Ann's autopsy ruled that she was strangled to death, and Tim was charged with murder in Pennsylvania, prompting investigators in North Carolina to take a second look at Elaine's death. He was convicted of murder in both states and is serving life without parole. Number 1. Edward Wayne Edwards. Edward Wayne Edwards became a habitual criminal at a very young age. He spent time in juvenile detention and was dishonorably discharged from the military, making it clear early on that he had a problem with authority and following rules. In 1955, he escaped from jail while serving time for a break-in. For the next several years, he became a drifter and made a living robbing gas stations across the U.S. The FBI added Edwards to its 10 most wanted list in 1961. He was captured the following year and was paroled in 1967. Edwards claimed to be reformed and became a motivational speaker, but eventually went back to crime, committing arsons, armed burglaries, and other violent acts, and often getting away with it. He was always on the move, living under various aliases as he carted his wife and 5 kids from place to place. The family lived in more than a dozen states between 1974 and 2009, when Edwards' DNA was connected to a double murder in Wisconsin. One of his adult children had tipped off law enforcement to his possible involvement in the crime after discovering evidence during their efforts to understand their bizarre upbringing. By then, Edwards was 76 years old. The double homicide, known as the Sweetheart Murders, happened back in 1980, nearly 30 years earlier, when couple Tim Hack and Kelly Drew vanished from a wedding reception. Their decomposing bodies were found 2 months later, and the medical examiner ruled that they had been stabbed and strangled. Investigators connected Edwards with 5 homicides that took place between 1977 and 1996, including the Sweetheart murders and 3 others in Ohio. In some cases, his motive was financial, but his reasons for committing some of the murders are unclear. When asked if he enjoyed killing, he said, "Of course not, but that you sometimes have to do what you have to do." To this day, authorities suspect that he's responsible for additional killings that he was never definitively connected to. Edwards was convicted of all 5 of the murders he was tried for and was sentenced to death in Ohio, but he died on death row in 2011 from natural causes. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next door to someone who seems ordinary and friendly but has connections to multiple suspicious disappearances, or a group of people who perform strange rituals in their backyard but don't seem to be breaking any laws? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.